why don't we go ahead and get started then? I'm Kostas Panagopoulos. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department here at Northeastern, professor of political science, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to our 2020 Constitution Day lecture, which is a collaboration between the Department of Political Science, Northeastern School of Law, and the Yale Information Society Project. We are delighted today to welcome Jack Balkin, the Knight Professor of Constitutional Law and the First Amendment at Yale Law School, to deliver this year's lecture. Following his remarks, additional remarks will be made by three of our colleagues here at Northeastern: Bill Mayer, who's a professor of political science, Jeremy Paul, professor of law, and Patricia Williams, University Distinguished Professor of Law and Humanities, all here at Northeastern. So I'd like to thank everyone for this timely and important discussion. Last year when I introduced this, I said I couldn't imagine a more important time and timely moment for a discussion along the lines of the Constitution Day lecture last year. I clearly couldn't foresee 1 year ahead to this year and how much more crucial it is to be talking about the Constitution and aspects of it. And we couldn't be more thrilled to have someone as knowledgeable and insightful as Professor Balkin to talk about it. Jack Balkin is Knight Professor of Constitutional Law and the First Amendment at Yale Law School, as I said. He's the founder and director of Yale's Information Society Project, which is an interdisciplinary center that studies law and new information technology. He also directs the Abrams Institute for Freedom of Expression and the Knight Law and Media program at Yale. He is a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences and an author of over 100 articles in different fields, including constitutional theory, internet law, freedom of speech, reproductive rights, jurisprudence, and the theory of ideology. He has written widely on these topics, and his books include Living Originalism, Constitutional Redemption, Political Faith in an Unjust World, and the Constitution in 2020. He received his PhD in philosophy from Cambridge University and his AB and JD degrees from Harvard. He's also taught at Harvard, at NYU, at Tel Aviv University, and the University of London. We are delighted that Professor Balkin has joined us today to talk about cycles of constitutional time, and it's my pleasure to turn things over to him now for his remarks. Thanks again to you and to everyone for joining us.
Thank you very much, Kostas, and thank you, Claudia. And thank you very much for inviting me for Constitution Day. My goal today is to talk to you about our constitutional system and its problems. And I want to take you beyond the day-to-day problems that we read about in the papers and give you just a little historical distance from our current difficulties. And I want to explain how we got there and where we're likely to be headed. So I have a new book out that just came out called The Cycles of Constitutional Time, and it talks about these ideas at length. But in this talk, I just want to give you an idea of the basic argument. And also I want to give you some ideas of how we could get ourselves out of this terrible predicament. People today are really worried that American democracy is in decline, and they are right to worry. Things are just terrible now, and I won't even depress you by going through the list of terrible things that are happening right now that you read about in the papers and things that we have to worry about. You'll just get depressed and then you'll leave and you won't hear the rest of my talk. So what I do want to tell you is that the framers of our Constitution well understood from their study of history and from reading the classical authors that all republics eventually fade away. All republics rise and fall. And they had seen every republic in history, and they had known this had happened. And one of the ideas that they came up with was to design a republican system that had so many different features in it that it could ride out the bad times, even if things didn't go well, in the hopes of a future renewal. So many people talk about constitutional design in terms of checks and balances and guaranteeing liberty and securing and limiting power. But I want you to think about how our Constitution is designed in a different way, as a kind of insurance premium for republics. That is, it's designed so that you have a system, even if it isn't perfect and rather unwieldy and difficult to get things done, nevertheless, it provides a certain kind of insurance for the worst of times, so that things have a chance to bottom out and get better. So I want you to think about the constitutional system that we have in the United States from this perspective. in terms of cycles of expansion and contraction, of rise and fall, and better and worse. Things will not happen the same way that they happened in the past, but Mark Twain is supposed to have said that although history may not repeat itself, it often does rhyme. So I want to talk about where we are right now and the various cycles that constitute our what I call constitutional time. And in another way of thinking about it is this talk is like a watch. It's telling you what time it is. So there are three different kinds of cycles I want to talk about today. The first is the rise and fall of political regimes and dominant political parties. The second is the waxing and waning of political polarization. And the third is sporadic episodes of what I call constitutional rot that are often followed by periods of constitutional renewal. Let me take them one at a time. Now, because the United States has a presidential system rather than a parliamentary system, and because it early on organized itself into parties with relatively broad coalitions, American politics turns out to feature regimes, long regimes in which one party tends to dominate. It doesn't win all of the elections, but it wins most of them, and it tends to set the agenda for what's thought politically possible at a particular period of time. Easy way to see that is to compare the last two regimes. The regime that existed when I was born was the New Deal civil rights regime, in which the Democratic Party was the dominant party, and that's the period in which you get labor movement is powerful, and you get the Civil Rights Acts passed, the Voting Rights Act is passed, the Social Security Act is passed, Fair Labor Standards. It's a very different world than the world of the regime that followed it, which is the Reagan regime, which begins about 1980 or so. This is the regime of neoliberalism, in which labor unions are in eclipse, in which civil rights is cut back, and in which you get a conception of neoliberal governance. And it's the regime that I've been living through really most of my adult life. There have been about 6 of these regimes in American history, each featuring a dominant party, in which case each party rises, dominates, and then eventually falls apart, often the victim of its own success. The transitions between these regimes are often very confusing. You guys may not remember this, but right around the end of the 1970s, during the Carter administration, people were wondering whether America was even governable and whether the presidency was too big a job for one person. And that's because basically the New Deal civil rights regime was basically running out of gas, and it was soon going to be displaced. I like to call this, I have a lecture about this I gave about 4 years ago, which I call The Last Days of Disco, which describes this period of the late 1970s and early 1980s. And then, of course, it was followed by a period of Republican dominance, and people stopped asking whether the United States was governable and whether the presidency, in fact, could be handled by one person. Nobody asked that question anymore, but that was a period of confusion between regimes. But that transition was nowhere near as difficult as this one is. And the reason why this one is so difficult and so problematic is because of the second cycle that I want to talk about now, which is the cycle of polarization. The thing to understand about polarization is that the kind of politics we now have hasn't always existed. There has been a cycle, one great cycle that we've been through now. Polarization in the United States is tied to the party system. But in fact, the kind of party system we have really dates from the Civil War, in which you have basically 2 major parties, Democrats and Republicans. And that system basically gets going in the wake of the Civil War. Polarization in the United States begins in earnest. It really gets powerful in the 1840s and 50s, and then of course, then you have the Civil War. But even after the Civil War, you have very powerful polarization. And it continues well into the 1890s, the end of the Gilded Age, or what I'll call the First Gilded Age. And then something happens. Politics in America begins to depolarize from the 1900s to the 1910s, the 1920s, and it bottoms out sometimes in the 30s and 40s in the middle of what's called the New Deal civil rights regime. And it's a completely different politics than you can imagine today, in which Republicans and Democrats cross aisles and engage in all sorts of bipartisan projects. The great civil rights acts of 1964 and 65 and 68 are bipartisan projects of liberal Democrats and moderate to liberal Republicans. And many of the laws that we live under today, including the environmental laws, are bipartisan projects of different parties. And that's because each party's coalition is incoherent. The Democrats during this period are a coalition of Northern liberals and Southern Democrats who agree on class issues and are intensely divided over issues of culture and race. And the Republicans also are an incoherent coalition. After the Voting Rights Act of '65, and as we progress into what's now called the culture wars, what happens is that this coalition, the Democratic coalition, breaks apart. The Republicans learn how to use culture war issues to break that coalition apart and to start to form a new coalition. Newt Gingrich is a key figure in American history. He figures out that exacerbating polarization and treating your opponents as the most worst kind of enemies is successful. It's a good politics, and it can actually make the Republican Party a majority party again. And so he plays it for all it's worth, and other folks figure it out. And so what you get through the 90s and aughts is increasing polarization. And now we are at levels that are similar to those during the Civil War and the end of the First Gilded Age. And that means that when there's a transition from one dominant party to another, it's just terrible. Nobody wants to give up power because they completely fear the other side and they don't want to do business with them and they can't compromise with them. And so it's just a very fraught time. And that leads to the third of the cycles that I want to discuss, which is the cycle of constitutional rot and renewal. This idea is a very old idea. It's one of the oldest ideas in political theory. It goes all the way back to the Greek historian Polybius. But even before him, really, it's in Plato and Aristotle. It's the idea that political regimes can't last forever and that eventually they decay. The theory of republics is the idea that republics are very delicate things, always subject to decay and corruption. And that was very much in the minds of the framers of the Constitution, who worried that the American experiment couldn't last, and they tried to make it last as long as possible. Constitutional rot is actually a feature of republics, of Republican governments. It's the process by which a constitutional republic becomes less democratic and less Republican over time. And you have to understand this idea, however, in context. The American Constitution has never been fully democratic. It's never been fully Republican. It's always had enormous amounts of violations of liberty. Slavery was allowed in the United States and even celebrated for the first part of our country's history. And even after slavery is ended, there are all sorts of forms of inequality that occur. So when we talk about episodes of backsliding from democracy and republicanism, we can only talk about this in relative terms. And we have to understand that the redemption of our Constitution is always an unfinished project. And so when we're talking about rot today, we're really talking about a backsliding from a particular form of democratic politics, which was deeply imperfect and deeply unjust in many ways. There are four basic features of rot. The first is the increasing inequality of wealth. The second is increasing political polarization, in which you regard your fellow countrymen as enemies who can't be trusted. The third is loss of trust, both in your fellow citizens, in politicians, and in institutions generally. And the final one is policy disasters. Things like Katrina, for example, or the Iraq War, or the 2008 financial crisis, which basically show the inability of politicians to actually govern the country and also increase lack of trust in them. We are in terrible shape right now. And we have seen in our time the kinds of propaganda that were practiced in the Soviet Union, now in the United States. And that is also a sign of constitutional rot as well. So the framers, they actually thought that something like this would happen one day. They feared the rise of demagogues. They feared the rise of rot in republics. And they tried to design the Constitution so that it could ride out these bad times and rue itself. But we're in a terrible situation if you think about these three cycles I've just described. Because we're in the last days of a debilitated regime, the Reagan regime, which is now running on empty. The dominant party is losing its dominance and is fighting with every last ounce of strength it has to prevent the creation of a new regime. We are at the peak of a cycle of political polarization, which we have not seen since the 19th century. And we are suffering from an advanced case of constitutional rot. There is no exact analogy between the situation we're in right now and the past, but there is one close analogy, and the close analogy is to the Gilded Age, or what I will call the First Gilded Age. Our situation is the most like the 1890s, the end of the First Gilded Age. And let me explain and describe what the Gilded Age was like, and let me see if you can figure out any similarities to our current situation. The end of the First Gilded Age, around the 1890s, is a period of vast inequalities of wealth, and huge fortunes and monopolies have been created by rapid technological change. And this is also a period in which there have been huge waves of immigration, new Americans entering the country, which have destabilized American politics and created a whole series of fights over identity and race. It's also, the First Gilded Age is also a period of demagogues. It's a period of social unrest, of violence, of riots, and assassinations. Politics in the First Gilded Age is thoroughly corrupt. And because the cost of printing newspapers has decreased, there's intense competition among newspapers, and newspapers have to fill up content, which means that media increasingly resort to completely false stories that are just simply sold in order to increase newspaper circulation. This is the era that produces the phrase we can now call yellow journalism. Politics during the First Gilded Age was increasingly stupid and demagogic, and the parties were at each other's throats. Well, that would never happen again, of course. Well, in fact, it has. And that's why our situation is the closest to the end of the First Gilded Age. And if you lived during that period in the 1890s, and you looked around at the demagogy, at the stupidity of politics, at the polarization, at the vast inequalities of wealth, and at the deep, deep corruption of American politics, you might well have thought that American democracy would fail. But it didn't. In fact, something else happened. What happened was we got through that period, and after the end of the Gilded Age comes the first progressive era, which is a period of reform and constitutional creativity, not only at the federal government level, but at the level of the states, and then eventually a New Deal. My view is that we are now in our second Gilded Age, and we are on the cusp of what might be a second progressive era, or possibly a third Reconstruction. When you think of our constitutional system, you tend to think about the courts. But in times of constitutional rot and advanced constitutional rot, the courts are mostly useless. They are a lagging indicator of the cycles of constitutional time. They become polarized after politics has already become polarized, and they suffer the effects of constitutional rot long after constitutional rot has basically taken over the system. The basic message I'm going to give you is that in situations like our current one, you shouldn't give up on judicial review, but you shouldn't expect that it's going to save you. The courts are not coming to save us. They're not going to be the heroes. The only thing that has a chance to renew American democracy, as happened, by the way, at the beginning of the 20th century, is political mobilization. That is the only chance we have for constitutional rot to end and produce renewal, just as it did in the first part of the 20th century. But even that renewal, I should point out, was not a perfect renewal. It was imperfect in many periods. I talked about the Progressive Era, but the Progressive Era is also the period in which the Ku Klux Klan is renewed and racial tensions are at their height. The story I'm telling you is a story of hope, but it's a story of hope mixed with the difficulties of our time. Hope doesn't mean certainty. It shows you a path, but you have to take that path. But the question you might want to ask yourself after having me told you our situation is, why do we even think there is a path? In other words, why do we even think that renewal of any sort is possible? So I want to spend the rest of my talk talking about the possibilities of renewal. Possibilities, not certainties. Hope, not necessity. So if you want to think about renewal, and renewal of institutions, and renewal of countries and democratic systems, there are two things that renewal requires. The first is mobilization. The second is destruction. So let me take those in turn. How might people mobilize? Well, one of the interesting things about American politics until the last 5 or so years was that American politics was mostly demobilized. But something interesting happened in the last 5 years. There has now been more mobilization in the United States than at any time since the 1960s. And there has been continuous agitation through the Trump years, although it hasn't all been brought together in one focal point. The Women's March, which occurred the day after Trump's inauguration, was actually larger than his inauguration, and it occurred everywhere around the country. And then the Women's March basically dies away mostly. There's Black Lives Matter all the way through this period, and then there's a period in which Black Lives Matter is mostly an eclipse, or at least it isn't being covered by the news media. And then George Floyd was murdered. And at that point, it sparked a series of protests around the country and indeed around the world that haven't stopped yet. They're still going on. And Trump, the president, is trying to make them into a campaign issue. He's trying to run a sort of Nixonian campaign of law and order. But I have to tell him it's not 1968 anymore. What these mobilizations are a sign. They're a sign of something. They're the sign of a larger potential transformation. What becomes of that mobilization, of course, is yet to be determined. The other element in potential renewal, and I use the word potential advisedly, which most people tend to forget about, is destruction. In fact, renewal often is preceded by destruction, and destruction clears the path for renewal. But you might want to ask yourself, this is both good and bad, you see. What has Trump destroyed? What is he likely to destroy? For good or ill, Donald Trump is the great destroyer of American politics. And because he is such a reckless destroyer of everything, he is unwittingly opening up the possibilities for renewal, which may or may not be taken. I want to come back to that point later on in this talk. I want you to then go back to the three cycles I mentioned before and think about each of them in turn. Let's talk about the cycles of regimes. We've been living through the Reagan regime, in which the Republican Party is the dominant party. That regime is exhausted. The Republican Party has offered the same basic ideas, commitments of interest and ideology, to deal with all the problems of the first part of the 21st century. And although they may have been good in 1980, they're not particularly useful in the 2010s and 2020s. The party has been unable to win majorities in presidential elections, and has only been able to take the presidency through the Electoral College victories, and then one popular vote victory in 2004. Although President Trump may well eke out another Electoral College victory, in my book, I argue that the next regime is likely going to feature the Democrats as the new dominant party, and it will set a different agenda. A new coalition is now becoming dominant. This is the extension of the Obama coalition, which consists of minorities, women, young people, professionals, people living in cities and suburbs. This coalition has grown over time, and the president, Trump, is making it even larger through his scorched earth style of politics. One problem that the current regime faces, the Reagan regime faces, is a failure of generational replacement. Regimes fall apart not simply because people leave the party, but because new folks enter politics and decide not to sign up. The problem for the Republican Party is that the majority of young people increasingly despise it. And so although there are some young people who are becoming Republicans, many more are not. That is a real problem for a regime to stay in business. And so for that reason, what we're likely to see is a new dominant party with a different set of commitments of interest and ideology than the old neoliberal regime. Now, you may be skeptical about that because you may think, well, new boss, same as the old boss. But it's really important to understand what comes with a change in regime. To understand that, think about the politics of the 1960s and think about the politics of the 1990s. The 1960s are a period of social revolution. The 1990s, on the other hand, are the heyday of neoliberal politics, with the liberal Bill Clinton sheepishly stating that the era of big government is over. That is a completely different world and a completely different worldview about what's possible in politics. It certainly wasn't true that the era of big government was over, by the way, but the era of neoliberalism was certainly in full swing. The Democratic Party has already given us a clue as to what its agendas of interest and ideology will be. The House, led by Nancy Pelosi, has already passed dozens of bills that are languishing in the Senate, but these bills can be taken up again. Let me just give you an example of what these bills are and their relationship to the possibility of constitutional renewal. The first and most important reform will be getting rid of the Senate filibuster, which will open up the possibilities of all sorts of reforms. H.R. 1, the For the People Act, was introduced right after the Democrats retook the House in early 2019. It focuses on voter access, combating voter suppression, election integrity, election security, regulating political spending, and government ethics requirements. It is primarily about democracy and good government reforms. It is a replay of the progressive era. And in addition, I expect that there will be a second Voting Rights Act, a John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that will follow. There will be money for reform of voting systems in states and incentives to create independent redistricting commissions. And there will be repeal of state voting limiting policies. The creativity will occur not only at the federal government, but a lot of it will occur in state governments. I expect also that there is a path for renewal for the Senate, which is malapportioned through the admission of DC and Puerto Rico to ameliorate some of the worst features, but not all of the features, of the design of our current Senate. And then let me turn to economic reforms that might be possible in such an era. The tax laws could be changed to stop the redistribution of risk and income upwards and risk downwards. Student debt could be reconfigured and relieved. Environmental reforms could reshape the economy. Antitrust law could finally make a comeback, and competition law could make a comeback to chip away at monopolies. This is very much on brand for a second progressive era, which, as you know, is the first progressive era is the era of attacking monopolies. Then let's talk about the courts, which are probably the greatest obstacle in the way of the reforms of a second progressive era or a third Reconstruction. There is no doubt that the federal courts, as they are currently constituted, will stand in the way of some of these reforms. They will stand in the way in the short run, but not in the long run. That's the basic lesson of American history. Eventually, the Supreme Court is going to follow the election returns. In the short run, we can probably expect a replay of the 1930s, in which the dominant party faced off against a court staffed by the old regime. And it was very difficult for some years, and eventually the old court gave way. The Democratic Party could, if it wanted to, stack the lower courts with judges, and it could threaten court packing if it wanted to. I don't know if it will, which would act in the same way that the court packing plan did in the 1930s to basically edge the old court toward acceptance of the new regime. Now let me turn to polarization, the cycle of polarization. I argue in the book that polarization will also eventually recede, but you may well ask yourself, when you look at the news and when you watch how people are treating each other, how this could ever be possible. Well, it happened once before. It happened right around the turn of the 20th century. One way of seeing it is to break the problem of polarization into its component parts. A major source of political polarization is wealth inequality. Polarization and wealth inequality tend to egg each other on. But at a certain point, as in the 1890s, too much inequality of wealth causes the voters to demand redistribution. And that's exactly what happened. That's when you get the federal income tax, struck down by the Supreme Court, by the way, and then reestablished as a result of the 16th Amendment. So let me talk a little bit about the problem of wealth inequality and polarization. The basic problem in democracies is that most people don't vote, except in Australia, where everybody has to vote. Well, in the United States, not everybody has to vote. Most people aren't voters, and the class of people who do vote tends to be wealthier than the average family. And this fact, a crucial fact, tends to impede pressures for redistribution. Immigration also has an effect. Immigration brings many new people into the country who cannot vote and are often poorer than voters. This tends to make the class of voters feel richer by comparison, but also resentful and less likely to support redistributive programs. Then there's the fact that if the dominant party happens to be aligned with the wealthy, they will try to shrink the voting base even further so that the median voter is even wealthier in comparison. And that will also resist downward pressure for redistribution. But there are limits to all of these strategies, as we discovered in the 1890s. Eventually, at the peak of the Gilded Age, wealth inequality becomes too great. Immigration slows. And as a result, what happens is you get what happened in the 1900s. You get pressures for redistribution, and the party coalitions begin to reform, and what happens is you get depolarization. The same thing is probably going to happen today. Right now, we see all the same signs. We see a party that's basically trying to prevent people from voting. We see vast inequalities of wealth and income, and we see a huge wave of immigration. That both of these have slowed redistributive pressures. But what's happening, and it happened long before Donald Trump, is that the rate of immigration in the United States has actually slowed. And of course, Trump didn't help it matters any, and the pandemic hasn't helped matters at all. And so what we're likely to see is that the pressures that have been building up for redistribution are now going to break through. That's especially the case because the party coalitions are gradually changing, which is the next thing I want to talk about. The way to understand political parties in the United States is that they're coalitions of people who agree on some things but disagree on others. They're constantly evolving as politicians look for new voters, and they're constantly changing as one generation dies off and is replaced by a new generation. In the New Deal era, the parties tended to face off over class divisions, and they papered over internal divisions over identity issues, especially race and religion. Just think about the Democrats, who consisted of Southern Democrats who were racists, and Northern Democrats who tended to be, on the whole, racial liberals. After the sexual revolution and the civil rights revolutions, the Republican Party saw an opportunity to break that coalition apart through the culture wars and also through a strategy of deliberate polarization. They did that by making issues of identity central. Essentially, they created a form of right-wing identity politics and then asserted that Democrats were just interested in left-wing identity politics. In doing so, they created a new coalition which papered over internal conflicts over questions of the economy, wealth, and class. That strategy has been incredibly successful, so successful that in our time, at the peak of Republican power and the end of the Reagan era, the two parties now face off not over class as they did during the New Deal period, but over identity. There's now left-wing issues of identity and right-wing issues of identity. But in doing so, they're papering over divisions about class within each party. As time is going to go on, these internal differences over class will become increasingly pronounced, just as conflicts over identity did in the 1970s and onward. This will make the party coalitions increasingly incoherent and will offer once again the possibility of cross-party alliances. This, along with the gradual reduction in immigration and wealth inequality, will reduce polarization over time. Is it destined to happen? No. Could it happen? Yes. And that is how it might happen. The last thing I want to talk about is rot, constitutional rot. Constitutional rot comes from wealth inequality and polarization. And I've just explained to you why there's a possibility that polarization will decline over time. And I've given you examples of new reforms that might chip away at wealth inequality. I've also suggested how good government reforms might make it easier to vote and so improve democracy. My expectation is that if you put all of your marbles on the federal government, you'll be disappointed. Creativity and reform has to occur both at the federal level and at the state and local levels. There may even be some new constitutional amendments, but it's much more likely we'll get workarounds. For example, the way to get around the malapportion of the Senate is to admit new states, for example, DC and Puerto Rico. You can get around the Electoral College through ranked choice voting and through a state compact that basically solves the Electoral College problem. But eradicating constitutional rot may not be so simple. It will require the destruction of the old and the building out of the new. And that brings me to our president, Donald Trump. The great irony is that Donald Trump is also the great destroyer. He is the great destroyer in several senses of the word. First of all, he is destroying his own party, the current dominant party. He is destroying the coalition that put it in power. It will have to be rebuilt. Secondly, and very sadly, he is destroying government. He is undermining the Department of Justice, and it will have to be rebuilt. And the Department of Justice will have to be rebuilt just as it was after Nixon in the era of Ed Levy, who basically instituted many post-Watergate reforms that were designed to deal with the corruptions of the Nixon era. And third, the president is destroying the public health. He's creating problems of public health that will create natural constituencies for redistributive reform. In his inaugural address, President Trump said that there was an American carnage, and that American carnage ends now. In fact, he is the great creator of American carnage. He is destroying haphazardly and recklessly. What he destroys will have to be rebuilt. And the effects of climate change, of course, are ever more obvious. None of the things I just told you about in this talk are certain to happen. They will require a great deal of mobilization and a great deal of commitment and a lot of fighting. It won't be pretty. You should not expect that the next 2 decades will go smoothly, or even the next 3. But there is a possible future for American democracy. The resources are there if we have the courage to use them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jack, and I'm happy that this ended on a somewhat positive note. Yes. I'm Claudia Haupt. I'm an associate professor of law and political science here at Northeastern. I'm also an affiliate fellow at the Information Society Project at Yale, and I am absolutely thrilled that I get to moderate this absolutely stellar panel that we've assembled to provide some comments. We'll hear from Professor Mayer, who's a professor of political science at Northeastern, Professor Paul, who's a professor of law at Northeastern, and Professor Williams, who's University Distinguished Professor of Law and Humanities at Northeastern. Each of them will have about 10 minutes to react to Professor Balkin's remarks, and then we'll open it up for discussion among the panelists, and we'll also take some questions from the audience. So feel free to enter your questions in the chat. I'll monitor that. Professor Mayer.
Well, thank you very much. Jack and I are old friends, but in spite of that, I have to say that a lot of my comments are going to be critical or challenging, perhaps is a better word. I'm dissenting from Jack's picture on two grounds. First, I have a different reading of how the cycles of electoral politics works, and I'm not sure that a new democratic era, capital D democratic era, is in the works. Second, I think that in a number of cases, Professor Balkin is a bit unfair to conservatives and Republicans and overly indulgent of liberals and Democrats and overlooking their faults. I will confine my comments primarily to chapters 2, 3, and 5 because my expertise is more in electoral politics and in political behavior than in constitutional law per se. So, is the Reagan regime over? Are we on the cusp of a new era that will be dominated by the Democrats? Well, no doubt the Democrats hope that's true, but you should note that that prediction has been made many, many times in the past, and it's never yet come true. In 1974, Lanny Davis, a political operative who would later become a top advisor to Bill Clinton, wrote a book called The Emerging Democratic Majority, which said that the Democrats were on the verge of starting a new political era, different from the New Deal era, but nevertheless dominated by the Democrats. And his argument was recognizably similar to the one Jack makes. Democrats would draw special strength from rising groups like women, racial minorities, suburbanites, the student left of the 1960s, and so forth. Well, as Ronald Reagan's election 6 years later made clear, didn't happen. Then in 2002, John Judas and Rui Teixeira wrote a book called The Emerging Democratic Majority, same title, that made the same argument. And though the 2006 and 2004 elections didn't turn out exactly the way they had hoped, the 2008 election seemed to bear out their prophecy. The Democrats won the presidency by a decisive margin and then racked up large majorities in both the House and the Senate. And more than a few commentators said, the new Democratic era has finally arrived. Harold Meyerson, for example, said that, quote, even though Obama's victory was not as lopsided as Franklin Roosevelt's in 1932, his margin among decisive and growing constituencies make clear that this was a genuinely realigning election. Well, then the Democrats suffered major losses in 2010 and 2014, did retain the White House in 2012, but by a smaller margin than Obama had won it in 2008, and of course surrendered the White House again in 2016. Now, why do these predictions keep falling short? Well, I would argue, in fact, I did argue in an article I published a few years ago, that it's because all these predictions are based on a fundamentally wrong theory about the causes of realignments or new regimes. What's probably the dominant theory on this subject, and it's the one Jack embraces in his book, is that realignments are the kind of inevitable product of social change. A party is created around one set of issues and cleavages, like slavery and the Civil War, But gradually that set of issues fades in significance. There's an accumulation of social and demographic changes. And so finally, a new party system is established to take its place. I have a different take, which I would call the catastrophe theory of realignments. In my view, realignments or political regimes are created in the wake of some kind of serious catastrophe. For example, what political scientists generally call the third party system, what Jack calls the Republican regime, was forged by the Civil War, clearly a catastrophe. The next party system was established in reaction to the second worst economic depression in American history. And the New Deal system was the result of the worst depression in American history. And in my view, if those catastrophes had somehow not occurred, the realignments would not have occurred. What's critical about my theory is that catastrophes only create the opportunity for a new party system. Whether a realignment actually takes place depends on the success of the new incoming party in handling the set of problems they are confronted with. So the Civil War only made the Republicans the dominant party because the North won the Civil War. If the South had won, things would have been very different. The Republicans gained new life and new votes after 1896 because beginning in 1897, the Depression that started in 1893 actually ends and a sustained period of economic growth ensues. Now, what does that imply about the present? Well, it means that in order to become the new dominant party, to establish a new political regime, the Democrats don't just have to have a lot of constituencies that might be inclined to vote for them. They also have to show that they can actually solve most of the problems that now afflict the country. The Obama presidency, and this is why it was not realigning, was unable to convince the American public that it was up to the job. Yes, the country did recover from the 2008 recession, which was wrongly dubbed the worst economic mess since the Great Depression. It wasn't. But it was the slowest, most anemic recovery in recent American history, and incidentally may not have had anything to do with Obama's policies. The Affordable Care Act was a mixed bag, and the president had no great foreign policy achievements to boast about. More generally, on page 17 of the book, there's a list of problems that the Republicans have supposedly not been able to cope with. I'll read the list. Quote, stagnant wages, decreasing social mobility, an opioid epidemic, crumbling infrastructure, a decaying educational system, crumbling student debt, unaffordable health care, and so on. What's notable is that Professor Balkin simply assumes that the Democrats have all the answers to these problems. That Democratic policies will work and everything will be just fine and dandy. Well, I disagree. Did the Obama Democrats make health care more affordable? Maybe for a few people, but not for most Americans. When the proposal was being debated, the White House actually claimed that their bill would save the average family $2,500. Didn't happen. Did stagnant wages revive during the Obama presidency? Did social mobility increase? Not that I'm aware of. Or take education. What's the Democratic plan for improving education? It's to spend more money. There's a nice book called Education Myths by an education scholar named Jay Green, where there's a nice set of graphs that show between 1945 and 2001 real per pupil spending on elementary and secondary education increased by 700%, more than 7 times. And yet educational test scores, he shows, have been absolutely flat during that period. Yet every time you stick a microphone in front of a Democrat and ask him or her how to improve our schools, they'll say, oh yeah, we got to spend more money. Let me add in this connection a few words about the 2020 election. I do expect Donald Trump to lose, but not because a new political regime is in the process of coming into being. He will probably lose because he is an incompetent, repulsive blowhard. He needlessly alienates all sorts of people who might support him simply based on his policies. The good news for Republicans is that that kind of damage to the Republican image, which is undoubtedly serious in the short term, seems to disappear rather quickly. So the Republicans had a very bad image going into the 2008 elections as a result of the misgoverning of George W. Bush. But by 2010, they posted major gains in both the House and the Senate. Let me say, I mean, I realize I'm bumping up time, but let me just say a few words about chapters 3 and 5. As I say, my principal complaint about these chapters is that you place the blame for polarization and constitutional rot almost entirely on the Republicans. For example, you say that Karl Rove decided that to win elections, he had to target the Republican base. Do you really believe that the Democrats don't do the same thing? Similarly, you imply that the slash and burn style of rhetoric began with Newt Gingrich. What any conservative would have told you is that it really began with Ted Kennedy's assault on Robert Bork and has continued with their assault on Brett Kavanaugh. Similarly, in your account of constitutional rot in chapter 5, I think you neglect the significant way that liberals have contributed to the conditions you deplore. For example, why has a conservative media like Fox News and talk radio developed over the last 40 years or so? The answer is because there is such a pronounced liberal bias to what you call the mainstream media. I am, as it turns out, now writing a book on media bias, and in one chapter of that book, I have brought together 27 different surveys of American journalists. And what they show overwhelmingly is that reporters and editors are significantly more liberal than the American public on all sorts of issues, but particularly on cultural issues like abortion, affirmative action, and so forth. To cite just one statistic, when asked how they had voted in the most recent presidential election, on average, 74% of journalists said they voted Democratic. This in a set of elections in which only 49% of the public voted Democratic. And among elite reporters, the people who work for the national television networks, the New York Times, or the Washington Post, the numbers are even more lopsided. So of course a set of conservative media institutions emerged. If you really want to have a common base of information, the way to do that is to get these elite media to hire a lot more conservatives and to be a lot more aware of all the major and minor ways that their biases show up in their coverage. But I know of no major effort to do that. Similarly, at one point, you claim that big wealthy interests are using their money to make sure that universities support their views and interests. I would be curious to hear you name one university where that's been the case. There's also a lot of survey work about the political views of American professors, and they're even more lopsidedly liberal than journalists are. As part of my book, I've also been analyzing a database assembled by a group called FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which collects information about all the attempts to disinvite or obstruct the presentations of speakers on campus. And what the FIRE data make clear is that there are lots of such attempts and that they are overwhelmingly efforts by liberal students, faculty, and administrators to disinvite moderate and conservative speakers. So if lots of Americans distrust elites, my answer is darn right they do, and elites have more than earned that distrust. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Paul.
Thank you very much for inviting me to do this, and Jack, welcome to Northeastern. I'll resist the temptation to talk about the things that Bill just said. I guess we can get to that later. So my first point is for all the students who are listening today. Jack's book is a beautiful book, and I highly recommend that you take a look at it. Whether it's right or whether it's wrong, it's sometimes said that it's important to be right or wrong clearly, and the book certainly is that, and it provides a cogent description of a lot of US history in an easy to read narrative. In a certain sense, I think that, Jack, your talk didn't really highlight one of the things I would say was your major contribution. As a common law professor for decades now, I've gotten in front of my class the first day or the second day to talk about the genius of the Constitution as dividing power and protecting us against tyranny through the very familiar lenses of, on the one hand, division of power, which includes both federalism, dividing power between federal government and states, and separation of powers among the branches. And then also in terms of the Bill of Rights and protecting us through the power of judicial review. But what your book really highlights, although you didn't talk about it so much today, is that the genius of the framers includes a third thing, which you call cycles, which is built into the structure of the timing through which we put our people into power. So one of the things that can happen in a parliamentary system is that the country could be swept away by an exciting, I think it's fair to call Trump exciting, the nicest thing you might say about him, leader. But in our system, the president gets elected, but only a third of the Senate gets elected at that time. The House comes up again in 2 years. And so built into the what you call cycles is this other aspect. I think that this is a fantastic contribution that you've made. It's not something that people don't know about. Everybody's known about this forever, but it's really under stress compared to the other aspects of the system. And you have highlighted it in a useful way. Now that said, I do think that in your effort, and Lord knows we all want this effort, to try to describe to us a way of thinking about our current situation that gives us hope, you have maybe overstressed the idea of cycles as a way of solving things. So let me talk about two smaller ones, and then I'll make my one larger point and then turn things over to Professor Williams. So the first two smaller ones, one is the danger of what I might call describing the periods. So, you refer to the New Deal civil rights era. I gather you picked that because you think that the Democrats' presidencies were in charge in most of those periods. But I might say about that, it's like, to use your example from one of your earlier articles, it's like calling the period between 1955 and 1985 the rock disco era. Yes, they had the same record companies, but rock and disco are not the same. And I'm not sure that the New Deal era and the civil rights era are the same in any meaningful sense, particularly after reading Richard Rothstein's Color of Law book and reading the extraordinary compromises that the New Deal people made with the civil rights people. It's just an example, but it shows that in order to do the periods, you have to make a lot of decisions about what regime is in charge, where are we going. Even during the Reagan regime, I think if you talk to a lot of conservatives during what you're describing as the Reagan regime, they would still say that they're losing, right? During the Reagan regime, we got the Americans with Disabilities Act, we got the Earned Income Tax Credit, we got the increased college graduation rates, increased home ownership, increased secularization, increased intermarriage, the Affordable Care Act, we elected our first African-American president, we made dramatic advances in LGBTQ rights. The idea that we've been living since 1980 in this conservative regime is a very questionable one, which certainly is true on tax policy. But again, the question of how do you define the periods, and ultimately that's going to make a big difference for your overall thesis, because we could even do the periods like much, much longer, right? Hundreds of years. So there was a feudal period, and then there was a democratic period, and now we could have a new cycle, which could be just really a departure. So that's the first point, is the dangers of periodicity. Then the second thing is, what moment are we in? Right. So you didn't actually mention this in your talk, but in the book, you keep reminding us that it's not really that bad because we don't have a constitutional crisis, and you distinguish a crisis from what you call constitutional rot. A crisis is something where the system breaks down, whereas rot is just sort of slowly going. But from my perspective, and this is an example that I think will be easy for everyone to understand, think of two situations. One situation, you have a long, stable marriage, and one spouse gets a really high-pressure job. And the other one says, if you take that job, the marriage is over, right? I'm not going to live with you if you are. That's a crisis, right? And in the way you describe it. And the other one is the spouse says, I don't really care if you take that job or not, because if you're around, if you're not around, I'm kind of sick of you anyway, and whatever you want to do, that's fine. That's rot, right? And from my perspective, if I had to bet on which one of those marriages is going to make it, I'm going for the crisis, because if they navigate their way through the crisis, they'll be back good again. Whereas the rot is really hard to fix. And so relying on a cycle as a way of getting us out of rot, I think that that's a challenging thing. Which leads me now to my main point, which is, it seems to me that if you're going to find hope in cycles, you have to look at what is it about the United States that has allowed us to continue on these cycles, restoration and renewal, and what makes us different from other countries, and are those things still in place? Because if not, the risk is that rather than on a cycle, we're just going to spin out of control. And I think that a lot of people right now feel as though the Trump era is spinning out of control, and that the way Bill Barr has politicized the Justice Department, that we could, as you said, we could do a long list. And from my point of view, there's two things that are very different from the current moment that go beyond just polarization and income inequality. One of them is that we are rapidly headed towards massive demographic change, not like the Gilded Age where we had immigrants, but where it's actually going to be the case that we're going to have a white minority. And so the tribalism that is really fueling the Trump era is threatened in a way much more significantly than ever before. And the second is our economic situation vis-a-vis the world. So throughout the course of American history, the United States has been growing, relative to other countries, and now we're not. We are still the most powerful, vibrant economy in the world, although China is rapidly catching us. But our ability to dominate the share of economic resources and the share of the pie that we've always had is no longer continuing. And that puts the country in a state of, those two things together, put your average white working class American in a state of fear about the future that's very different from any place that we've been before. Now, does this mean that your optimistic scenario can't happen? Not at all. But you give us repeated reminders that it's not going to happen automatically, and that it takes mobilization. It's going to be challenging. But nonetheless, I sort of think of those as sort of vaccines, like warming us up for your cycle theory, but not really. The cycle theory, it seems to me, doesn't really tell us what direction that we're headed without more. Now, I love the things that you said about the failures of the Republican Party to generate loyalty from the younger generation. I don't know how much the Democratic Party has done that either. I certainly don't think that there's a lot of wonderful excitement for Joe Biden among college-age students, although I know we have a lot of college-age students on the call. And so I guess that from my perspective, more than just looking at those changes, the way to get out of constitutional rot has got to be a simple, sort of like, the democratic version of how we're going to make the country better. Otherwise, the cycle theory strikes me as dangerously optimistic. Even though you are telling us it's only hope, it's not a certainty, it nonetheless has a sort of connotation and feel about it like, oh, don't worry, we did this before, we can do it again. And my feeling is worry, because unless we all work, we're going to fall apart. So that would be my different perspective. And with that, I will turn things over to Professor Williams.
Thank you, Jeremy. And thank you, Bill, and most of all, thank you, Jack. It's such an honor to be on this panel. I'm not a constitutional scholar, but I am very concerned about the discourse of what Trump has done to almost make the Constitution seem irrelevant. And so that's what I think I'll deal with right now. I worry what's going on, how absolutely malign it is. The administration has managed to profoundly unsettle every last one of even the most settled institutions. And so I do see this as a constitutional crisis at the very least. And so that's the major disagreement I have with the book. Although again, I cling to the sense of optimism. I wish I could feel more optimism. But on the other hand, I'm somebody who at the age of 3, my aunt nicknamed me Cassandra. So that's just who I am. Now, I worry that the president is not merely the great destroyer, but he also has built certain counter institutions that go far beyond things like media, whether conservative or liberal. Trump's most potent counter institution at this moment, I think, is the armed citizen patriot, the rise of ungovernable militias, and the claiming of public space, this conversion of public accommodation into assertions of stand your ground, wandering, mobilized, claiming weapons strapped to their bodies. So what he constructed is a kind of severing, a split between sovereignty and governmentalism, and that worries me. Now, Jack distinguishes between a political crisis and a constitutional crisis, saying we're not there yet, that it's just rhetorical bluster and false claims. And I notice in your paper that there's actually, I think it's a little bit more pessimistic than the actual text, since the book may have gone to press. But I think that though the claims may be false, or though the rhetoric may be bluster, this administration is creating a new reality with those words. And I think that the administration is very skillful in the making of meaning. And in that making of new meaning, the obliteration of constitutional history by replacing it with myth. And this is not just interpretation. All interpretation, I suppose, to some degree, is imaginary worlds that are being created, utterly fictive enchantments upon which his people, not the people, act. You describe in this book propaganda as designed to confuse and divide and to diminish trust. But propaganda's most insidious power is contained in its etymological root. It means literally that which must be done. So propaganda is literally the feminine gerundive of propagare, or that which must, should, ought to be propagated, spread, and disseminated. And we don't have the gerundive in English. And I think we tend not to recognize the syntactical power of what it does, even if it's not embedded per se in our language. It operates quietly in our political sphere. But the gerundive is a verb that functions as an adjective, bringing a kind of transitivity to the object that ends up in a formation that implies obligation, mustness, and need. And if you think of it with executing a verb, of having done something, a process of motion, then maybe the gerundive is implicated, even if we don't have it as clearly decipherable matter in English. But I think it's important to be aware of this as what's happening in our politics, because it is a construction of obligation, of mustness, of readiness and ripeness to be done as a grammatical neediness that must be met and fed, a future participle that, while passive, drives a sense of the necessary. And that's my anxiety. Now, at the same time, I want to pair that discourse, that rhetoric of urgency and mustness with your idea of constitutional cycles, which I love. I love the sense of the foregrounding of time. Classics scholar Paul Kosman has written a book called Time and Its Adversaries in the Seleucid Empire, which existed about 2,000 years ago. And until most of the Greek, Egyptian, Mesopotamian world had calendrical cycles that were described by the seasons or the reign of a king. So that time itself was geographically located, and time ended at the end of the season, or perhaps at the reign of a king. And then things would begin again. And in that beginning again, debts were forgiven. We moved on into a new world. The Seleucid Empire introduced linear time as we know it. That is to say, the calendar goes on and on. We have that from the Seleucid Empire, we are now 2020, we'll be 2021, and ad infinitum. And that infinity of time introduced a breach with the tradition of amnesty and forgiveness of debt. Paul Kosman aligns that introduction of linear time with the notion of apocalypse, and thinks that that's when apocalypse, that notion was introduced, that the infinity of the psychic burden, that driver might have been forgiveness of debt. There was never a new beginning. There was never any room or time for amnesty. And that lack of forgiveness creates a desire for end time, for the apocalypse. And again, we think of apocalypse as merely catastrophic, but it is also a time of forgetting, perhaps in its best sense. ultimately forgiveness as providing what Hannah Arendt says might be redemption in its power to interrupt what she calls the predicament of irreversibility, to step beyond ourselves into something other than opposition, to interrupt the reflexive link between thought and action. I've been reading philosopher Paul Virilio's excellent little book, The Administration of Fear. He has said that, analogous to the atomic bomb, we live in a time of an informational bomb that establishes fear as a global environment. And this creates what he calls a community of emotions that every part of society, synchronization of emotion that surpasses of opinion that was typical of the power of mass media in the second half of the 20th century. He describes this as having created an acceleration of reality whose speed challenges the limits of human thought and time. And the instantaneity is immobilizing, operates at billionths of seconds, like flash trading on the stock market, perhaps, so that one can't anticipate what really surrounds us until it suddenly just is. He described what he called mass illuminism of the computer age as a kind of propaganda of speed whose ecology has made the world uninhabitable, at least for politics and democracy, as an art of the possible, in which realm of possibility projects are elaborated over time with a past, with a present, and with a future. And maybe all of this sounds grim, but I found Virilio's analysis really helpful in thinking about why everything right now feels not only transformed by this administration, that our past feels lost and accessible to coherent thought. It helps me think beyond this moment as mere mismanagement of broken norms, or even as corruption, but as the intentional inducement of paralysis. A bomb has gone off. We blinked. The world is not the world as we thought it. We are stunned, uncertain. We don't know if the ground is still stable. We freeze. And I think there's good reason to freeze, to be very afraid. But I also think it's helpful to appreciate that at least some of this fear is the product of that highly manipulated community of emotions, as Virilio describes it, that overrides all other systems of thought. And to me, that points the way to a different political project than just reclaiming the power of the ballot, as important as that is. But rather, again, as with flash trading, the solution depends on new systems of regulation, particularly of media. And certainly I know, Jack, that you have been so involved in that regulation of media, because it's turbocharged manipulation of our families, of our feelings rather, and our families. It has an ability to create alternate realities that defy old distinctions between truth and lies, because whatever fairy tales assert themselves, they rule. And that regulation may not come from public governance as we knew it. It may not come from journalism. I suspect it may come from a younger generation whose lives are more enmeshed in the ultimately uninhabitable mind space of techno-instantaneity. I think there'll be a massive fleeing of that space. Maybe that's some of the cycle to which you allude. There has to be a fleeing of that space, an emotional resistance of some sort that at my age, I can't quite imagine. But it's not possible to live for long. It's too miserably exhausting with such temporal incoherence. It's not possible to hope with a sense of all future indefinitely suspended, as it seems to be right now. We have to step out, as Hannah Arendt recommended, out that more reflective, reflexive call to action without this kind of call to action without thought that seems to be driving, again, those the sense of finality that is underwriting our new, again, citizen sovereign without any responsibility to governmentalism. But again, Jack, I thank you for this book because I cling to your optimism, I cling to your hope, and I absolutely believe that there will be an after whatever this is, and an after of COVID era, and an after Trump. And I am somebody who keeps a picture of Nelson Mandela's prison over my piano. He was held in there for 25 years, and I have faith that this might not take that long. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jack will give you a few minutes to respond, and then I'll also want to encourage the attendees to type questions in the chat so that we can engage in a bit of a Q&A as well.
Maybe I thought I'd just say one thing for each of them because there's so much, and then we can go to questions. For Bill, I'll simply say to my old friend that we agree more than we disagree, because I think that the end of a regime is an opportunity, not a certainty, and you have to take it up. As you point out, the Democrats had a chance to take up a new dominance in politics in 1896, and they blew it. And they blew it in large part because they got blamed for the Depression of 1893, and they were not able, in fact, to do what they were supposed to do. As you say, even if you get power, you have to solve problems, and if you don't solve the problems, then basically you get punished politically. So on that we agree, and that in fact catastrophe may be the best way, a good way into understanding our current situation. So here's a way of understanding Bill's point in the context of our present politics. There's a catastrophe. There's actually multiple catastrophes. Where enormous numbers of people are thrown out of work. There's a global pandemic. Our response to it, the government's response has been terrible. And although not other countries haven't been so great either, in fact, they're running past us by leaps and bounds in terms of their abilities. So there's catastrophe, an economic catastrophe. There's also a climate catastrophe we've seen. The West is on fire. There are floods in the Midwest. There are, I think, 8 active potential hurricanes right now in the Atlantic. My wife watches NOAA all the time. This is a catastrophe brought on by climate. So there are plenty of catastrophes. And you could certainly imagine a majority of Americans blaming the Republican Party for not handling these catastrophes well. You could imagine it. And you can also imagine that then shoves the responsibility on the Democrats to see what they can do. And to take Bill's point, if they manage it adequately, they'll be rewarded. But if they don't manage it adequately and they don't satisfy the public, they won't be rewarded. But it's important to understand that you don't have to succeed completely in order to gain this vote of confidence. I don't think Roosevelt succeeded completely in the 1930s. I think that he did some things well and other things not so well. Yet he was given a vote of confidence by the American public. So I think that's right. I think catastrophe is a good way of thinking about how you get changes in governmental regimes. The second thing I want to talk about is Jeremy. And I think that's a very good point to say there are many ways of periodizing. I think that's right. It depends on what you're looking at. I tend to look at electoral coalitions and how those coalitions are formed, how they rise and fall. So New Deal civil rights makes sense for me because of how the Democratic Party was formed between 32 and 80. And it actually turns out it is the same coalition. It's just a coalition that's under enormous stress because the identity issue, the race issue eventually overtakes it. I also tend to agree with Jeremy's point that rot can be worse than crisis. Precisely because crisis, it's there. You have to face it. Rot sneaks up on you. Rot, you can pretend that it's not such a problem. And indeed, we have been pretending for a long time. And now we're kind of facing it. The other thing I wanted to say, too, is that it's also true that Jeremy's identified 2 really important features of our time: tribalism and the fear that American economic clout and influence is in decline. But I do want to emphasize that actually isn't new. It's that everybody of our generation, Jeremy's generations, have only known an America that was powerful and rich and relatively unified. But that's not the history of America. That's our America. That's the America that we grew up in. And we're now moving into a different America, which may, in fact, not be the most powerful nation on earth or the most economically powerful. But through most of its history, it wasn't the most powerful nation on earth, and it wasn't the most economically powerful nation on earth. And that may happen again. The other thing is that if you go back to the 1890s, you think of white in a certain way, right? White didn't exist in the same way. White didn't mean the same thing in 1890 it means now. People were very worried that those who were white were going to be overtaken by various ethnic groups. There was a whole debate over the hyphenated American in this period. But I do have to say that it may be different this time. It may be different because the collection of groups is different and things don't happen the same way. So I think you are right to worry that this time might be different. For Pat, I want to say that I really agree that it is possible to see this period as a period of crisis. Even though I use the term rot to diagnose it, crisis is when you think that the system is about to break down. And I don't think anyone can look at our current politics and not imagine the possibility of things breaking down. You mentioned the existence of paramilitary groups roaming around the country. You also mentioned the role of propaganda, the role of digital media as making it impossible for us to see what's actually going on, and diverting our attention and distracting us, and and making us lose the past. And so we have this ever eternal present myth. There's an interesting relationship, although I don't want to get us too distracted, between this idea of myth making and propaganda as what must be done, and the literature on fascism, which also tries to understand how myths are mobilized for the purpose of creating a necessity of action. Which is not to say that I'm claiming the United States is in a fascist period, but I'm just saying that there's a similarity between the literatures that you're discussing and the literature on fascism. I also think that, as you know, I work on media, and yeah, there's going to be a different form of media regulation than we've known before. The media regulation we have now is a neoliberal media regulation, which confuses freedom of speech with capitalism. We hope that the next model will be different, that it won't simply be neoliberal. But that's in the future. I don't know what's going to happen. But ask me about media. I love to talk about it. There you are. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Let's take some questions.
All right, so either raise your hand or put your questions in the chat. I will be monitoring. There are some questions. Panelists, I will just read the questions, or do you want to read along?
Which question are we starting with?
We're starting with, let's see. We have Sarah who's asking, could you further explain the relationship between a potentially ascendant progressive regime in politics and constitutional renewal?
Well, so there have been new regimes in American history without renewal. So what makes this a particularly interesting moment is that this is a period of advanced rot. And that's what requires renewal. This is, so the bad version of the closest analogy, the bad version is 1859, Civil War, leads to Reconstruction, which is a kind of renewal. And the more hopeful version is it's 1899. So end of the Second Gilded Age, the renewal, progressive era. We don't know which one it is yet. My hope is it's more like 1899 than 1859. But there are many periods in which regimes end and you get new regimes that don't have this kind of fraughtness. That's not what happens in 1824 to 1828. It's not really what happens between 1978 and 1984.
Great, and then we have a media question. So this is a question about media bias that I think was originally in response to Professor Mayer, but we'll obviously open it up since, Jack, you like to talk about media.
No, let's ask Bill. Bill likes to talk.
Right, well, give this question to Bill.
Yeah, we'll go to Bill.
To what do I, as I recall, the question is, to what do I attribute media bias?
Attribute media bias, and then how do you propose media organizations balance staff bias without dipping into an underqualified hiring pool?
Well, to what do I attribute it? That's a complex question. Suffice it to say that it seems to be one of the characteristics of what is sometimes called post-industrial society, that it generates an educated class that is highly critical of the society that that has given them lots of advantages, and including a very good education, so that the liberal predominance among journalists is also, as I say, among academics. It's true in Hollywood. a vast number of other elite groups. How do you remedy it? Well, it's not clear to me that you would have to dip into. I suppose one solution would be that you can, you could have an affirmative action program for conservatives, which strange proposal. I have recently written something about affirmative action for conservative in academics, and I make the point that I don't think conservatives can consistently advocate that, since they oppose affirmative action everywhere else. But on the other hand, I don't see a basis by which liberals can oppose it either, since they seem to think that diversity is such a great thing in terms of race and gender and other criteria. And I don't know why it doesn't also apply to intellectual diversity. But I think simply making, a good example is at some point, I believe this was in 1997, ABC hired George Stephanopoulos and Bill Kristol as commentators. And very quickly, Stephanopoulos got promoted to be not just a commentator, but an actual reporter and anchor, and they dumped Kristol. There are lots of conservatives out there who could easily serve as decent reporters, editors, producers. For whatever reason, they just don't get hired. Anyway, I'll just leave it at that. But before that, I surrender the floor. I just want to say I was trying to get through my material very quickly, and I obviously had a lot to say, but I wanted to second everything that Professor Paul said about Jack's book. It really is a terrific read. It's very nicely written. It has a lot of interesting ideas in it. I think in particular, it is the first major attempt I know of to combine constitutional interpretation with American political development. And I think it is a great book for that reason.
So just to pick up on something you said about Stephanopoulos and Bill Kristol, is that Jeremy Paul just pointed out in the chat that Kristol was one of the not supporters of Trump. So if Jeremy, if you want to expand on that, feel free. Otherwise, we can move on to the next question.
Go to the next
question. Matthew's question is very good. Can I address that one?
Absolutely.
Matthew's question's out loud.
Can you repeat what the question is?
Just read it. Go ahead.
Matthew's question is, at least some of the transformation towards more progressive settlement were partially driven by mass mobilization by the least well-off. These usually are facilitated by energetic radical organizations. This condition does not seem to be met today. Would this dampen your optimism, or do you reject the premise?
Yeah, this is a great question, because if you look at the New Deal, just as one example, or if you think about the 1860s, you have a sustained social mobilization for change. You have abolitionism and anti-slavery in the 1850s and 60s, and you have the labor movement in the 1930s. And what we have today is I actually talk about this at the very end of the book. One of the great successes of the Reagan regime was to basically debilitate labor, to undermine labor support in the general public, to defund labor organizations, and to use regulation, to change the law of regulation to basically make it very difficult to organize and to hamper labor. Labor was a key part of democratic politics, with a small d, not just a big D, throughout the middle of the 20th century. And both Republicans and Democrats saw labor as an important constituency. And by the end of the Reagan era, where we are now, basically labor is a spent force. And so you don't have a movement for working people like the labor movement. of working people as working people. There are lots of different attempts to try to reconstitute a movement of workers outside of labor unions and outside of the NLRB. There's a really interesting literature on this, and there's lots of interesting kinds of social activity. And of course, the Black Lives Matter movement, which then expands after George Floyd's murder, basically is a big movement. It doesn't have a clear leadership. Its goals are still diffuse, but it might turn into something that would be the driver of the next regime. But as I say in the book, we won't know for sure until long after this book is published. But that certainly is a source of energy. Matthew is right that energy in the form of mobilization requires a movement. It requires a movement that's concentrated and focused on a bunch of things. And we don't have that right now, but we might, based upon what we've seen in the last 4 years.
So I see that Dan Ehrman has his hand. Dan, I will allow you to talk. Let me see if I can do this. Wait, where'd you go? Here. Dan?
It was all addressed. We're good. We're good. It was all addressed.
All right. We're moving on from Dan. I'm going to mute you. So Michael Tolley wanted to know, given the difficulty in formally amending the Constitution, can we expect any more than what you called constitutional workarounds in the near future?
Yeah, I have a book that I did with my dear friend Sandy Levinson about this, in which Sandy insists that constitutional amendment is the only way to go, and I give a whole list of workarounds that we could adopt. My general view is that it doesn't hurt to push for constitutional amendments, but if you gather the necessary support, you probably can get a workaround more easily than you could get the amendment. It's also important to understand that the difficulty of constitutional amendment is sporadic. There are periods in American history where it's very, very difficult to amend the Constitution. And then there are periods in American history where it becomes easy, or relatively easy. And these things just, they're sporadic. And right now we're in a period in which it's very difficult. Polarization has a lot to do with that. But it may change. It may change, and constitutional amendment may be possible again. But until that point, I think you have to rely on workarounds. So with respect to the Senate, for example, I expect that the way to deal with that, at least in the short run, is to admit DC and Puerto Rico.
So final question, unfortunately, we're running up on time, but do you see a potential Biden presidency as a step to transitioning to a new regime, or would that still operate within the paradigm of the Reagan era?
That's a great question. So when Franklin Roosevelt is elected in 1932, he doesn't seem to be much of a visionary. And his platform, Bill can actually say more about this than I can. His platform is rather milquetoast, and he's accusing Hoover of not being more like Hoover in some ways. I mean, it's all over the place. His platform is all over the place in 1932. And then when he takes office, then suddenly he moves in a different direction, and he becomes the FDR that we know. Right now, Biden doesn't seem to be the avatar of transformation. He certainly doesn't seem to be that guy. He seems to be promising macaroni and cheese, comfort food, a restoration of a happier, less difficult time before the Orange Man took over. But he may not be the master of events. And it's also possible, as you say, that he may be a transition to the next generation of leaders who in fact will be the transformative group. We still don't know the answer to any of these questions.
I would only add to that, I mean, Jack is right. There's a famous quotation by Walter Lippmann when Roosevelt was running for president in 32. He says, "Roosevelt is a very nice man who without any great qualifications wants to be president." I would only say that I've read a lot about Franklin Roosevelt, and Biden ain't no Roosevelt. I'd be surprised if he's much of a transformative president, and he may, depending on how things work out, he may have only a very short time to be transformative, which is to say, it is possible that the Republicans will retake one or both houses. I mean, they may, I'm guessing they will lose the Senate by a couple of seats. But even that's not clear, but it wouldn't surprise me if they retake the House in 2022.
All right, excellent. Sadly, we're out of time, but I want to thank Jack and our excellent panel for the discussion. This was great. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you. This was a
Thank
great
you.
pleasure.
I would say again as well, Jack, you were terrific, and thank you for being willing to do this. And everybody, as a way of showing their appreciation, should go out and buy the book.
Absolutely. Available in fine bookstores near you.
Or via Amazon.
Yeah. Thank you very much, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jack. It was great to see you.
All right.